Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you are new, welcome, and don't forget to click on that subscribe button if you haven't already. I hope everyone had a joyous holiday season. I want to wish everyone happy holidays and a happy new year. Today I will be covering a very odd unsolved case. This is case number 20, and by the title of this video, I'm positive that if you are a fan of true crime content, you have heard of this case. Maybe you don't know a lot of the details, but I'm sure the name Brandon Swanson rings a few bells. Guys, I'm not going to lie, this case is strange, it's very confusing. There are a hell of a lot more questions than there are answers. Actually, when I think about it, there are really no answers for this one, and that makes it extremely frustrating. I will now go ahead, as always, put up my disclaimer. Once again, I will be talking about a case with shitty police work involved, which is, of course, always infuriating. And again, to be absolutely clear, we do not currently know what happened to Brandon. He is still missing. We do not know if he is alive or deceased. I will go over a lot of theories, but that's just what they are, theories. So if you're looking for an open and shut case, this is not that case at all. Also, really quick, I do want to announce that I am beginning to post all of the cases I've covered so far on podcast platforms. I already have a few out on Spotify. I will also be posting on Apple Podcasts and iHeartRadio as well. I'm hoping that all cases that I have covered, including this one, will be up and live on all the platforms I just mentioned by the end of the month. That way, if anyone prefers listening to true crime content instead of watching, that is now an option for you all. So stay tuned for that. But now let's get into today's case, the disappearance of Brandon Swanson. Brandon Victor Swanson was born on January 30th, 1989 in Marshall, Minnesota to Annette and Brian Swanson. He grew up along with his younger sister Jameen in Marshall. The Swansons were a normal, ordinary, loving family. Brian and Annette realized that Brandon was very smart at a very young age. He is described by his family and friends as being a bookworm and avid reader. He constantly was reading any books he could get his hands on, especially if it was a topic that interested him. He was also extremely passionate about science and enjoyed learning in general. With this in mind, it's no surprise that Brandon excelled in school. He soaked up information like a sponge and was happy to share his knowledge with anyone who was willing to listen. Brandon was extremely close with his family. His parents were absolutely proud of the respectable and bright young man that he was becoming. Brandon, being the older brother, was protective of his little sister. And even though they got into some petty arguments sometimes when they were little, as they grew older, they were developing a very close sibling relationship and were always there for each other. I have an older brother, so I do relate to the same dynamic all too well. Brandon was an all-around great kid in everyone's eyes. He was mature, responsible, and his parents trusted him and the decisions he made for himself. With his outgoing personality and witty humor, he had and was able to make a lot of friends. I couldn't find one person that knew Brandon that had anything bad to say about him. And honestly, that tells you something because, let's be honest, we all know people love talking shit about other people. Brandon graduated from Marshall High School in 2007. And with him being as smart as he was, he could have taken any path or school he wanted. He ended up enrolling in Minnesota West Community and Technical College the following fall and chose to specifically study wind turbines. And I gotta say that I'm barely aware what a turbine even is, let alone how one functions. I briefly looked into it, and the mechanics are so complex for anyone who is able to understand any of this has to be extremely intelligent, aka definitely not me. Brandon had remained passionate about his studies on wind turbines, and he excelled in his classes to no one's surprise. As classes were coming to an end in May 2008, Brandon began making plans to transfer to Iowa Western Community College in Council Bluffs, Iowa. It would have been the first time that Brandon would be away from his family and be on his own, but he would never get to go to this new college. Brandon was 19 years old at this time. He had his entire life ahead of him, and he had such a bright future. This would all change on one fateful night when Brandon Swanson seemingly vanished into thin air. And to this day, he has not been seen or heard from since. On Tuesday, May 13th, 2008, it was the last day of classes for the semester at Minnesota West Community and Technical College. The students were ecstatic to have completed the semester. It started out as a normal day for Brandon. He went to his last classes and he made plans with a few friends to celebrate the end of the school year that night. The most important part of this case is the location where all of these events take place, and it's a little difficult to follow, especially if you aren't from this area in Minnesota or if you are directionally challenged like me. But I will explain the best I can and put up pictures so you all can see what I'm talking about. But if you are listening to this via podcast, I do recommend pulling up Google Maps so you can see what I'm talking about. So Brandon's school, Minnesota West, is located in Canby, Minnesota, which is about 30 miles northwest of Marshall, where Brandon and his family lived. The small party that Brandon attended that night was in the city of Lind, which is approximately 7.1 miles south of Marshall. So Brandon and his friends drove from Canby to Lind, which would be about a 40-minute drive. A lot of different articles will make you think that this was a raging party that Brandon attended, but in reality, it was about 5 or 6 friends hanging out together, celebrating the end of their semester. It has been reported by the people that were present that night that Brandon spent a couple of hours hanging out. It was described as a very low-key event, nothing crazy like you would imagine, just a few friends having some drinks and talking to each other. Now, the people attending this gathering all admit to drinking that night, and all of them are under the legal age, so keep that in mind. After Brandon went missing, everyone attending this gathering all claimed that Brandon just had one drink and that was it. It is unknown what type of drink, whether it was hard liquor or something light like a beer, and honestly, I don't know how much I can believe that he had only one drink for a few reasons. I find it hard to believe that if you're hanging out with close friends and you're between the ages of 18 and 20 years old, that you're only having one drink in general, especially when we know that he was there for at least a couple of hours. I also find it hard to believe that everyone who was there happened to count the amount of alcohol being consumed by another person. I know that whenever I was socially drinking, I never once counted the amount of drinks my friends or family members were drinking. I have counted my own drinks, but never anyone else's. And again, these people were underage, so I think it could be very possible that they downplayed the amount of alcohol they drank that night in fear of getting in trouble. That's just my opinion. I obviously wasn't there, and I don't know any of these people, but that's just the thoughts I have about the debate of how much alcohol Brandon drank at this first party. The few people at this small get-together claim that Brandon was not showing any visible signs of being intoxicated when he left. Brandon left sometime between 10:30 and 11 p.m. He then traveled back to Canby in his Chevrolet Lumina, reportedly to visit another friend from school who lived in Canby. This friend was apparently leaving for some sort of trip, and Brandon wanted to visit this friend to say goodbye before they left. According to several reports, this home that Brandon was visiting in Canby happened to also be hosting a party that same night. And this is where some details are definitely sketchy or are missing. There's no reports explaining how big this party was. We know the party in Lind was a small, low-key event, but the party in Canby, we don't have many details on. People who were at this party also confirmed that Brandon did have one shot of whiskey. So we can conclude that throughout this night, Brandon had at least 2 drinks, and potentially he could have had more. Witnesses state that Brandon did not stay at this party very long. It is estimated he arrived in Canby at this party around 11:15 p.m., and witnesses agree that he left the party shortly before midnight. And again, the people at this party all say that Brandon still did not act intoxicated when he left. He seemed to be happy, in a good mood, and he had articulated to a couple of people how happy he was to have finished his first year of college. Brandon Swanson then got back into his Chevrolet Lumina and started the drive from Canby back to his family home in Marshall. The drive from Canby to Marshall is about 30 miles, and it's pretty much a straight shot. All you would have to do is enter Highway 68 and stay on the highway southeast to get to Marshall. There's no confusing turns. All you would need to do is stay on this highway to get back to Marshall. Here's where things get bizarre and start to not make any sense, because Brandon did not go on Highway 68 using the straight shot to get home. Let's remember that Brandon had made the drive from Canby to Marshall hundreds of times. He always used the same path to get to and from Canby and Marshall. This is a drive he made almost every single day, but on this particular night, for an unconfirmed reason, he did not use this path. He went on a more inconvenient route through side streets and gravel roads. Some people believe he did this because he wanted to avoid the police, who often were parked along the highway, and he wanted to make sure he didn't get pulled over, since he did have a couple of drinks. During my research, I did find a couple of articles that mentioned that Brandon possibly had gotten a DUI previously at the age of 17, but I'm not able to 100% confirm this, so take that with a grain of salt. Some people believe he could have made another additional stop to another friend that night at another location, and that's why he took a different path than usual. We have no way of knowing why Brandon actually took these side streets. These possible reasons are purely speculative. It's important to note that this area in Minnesota is very rural. These side streets and gravel roads are filled with vacant fields and farmland. These gravel roads have very little light available. There's definitely not a lot of traffic along these roads either. The gravel roads do follow Highway 68, but it's not a straight shot. There are a lot of twists and turns. I got lost just by looking at the pictures of these roads, and these are photos during the daytime, so I can only imagine how confusing it is driving on these paths at nighttime. Another important piece of information that I have yet to mention is that Brandon was legally blind in his left eye and needed his glasses to be able to see. So with limited eyesight, along with it being pitch black outside in the middle of the night, he's likely taking a path he's not very familiar with, and on top of that, there's also a possibility that Brandon was intoxicated during this drive. I can understand how it's possible that Brandon may have gotten confused or turned around during this drive. Brandon eventually turned on what's called a field road. This road runs between two crop fields on each side. With it being the middle of May, the crops that were being grown, which was corn, were starting to rise and grow. It's still pitch black, and even the high beams on Brandon's car weren't giving Brandon a lot of light to see too much ahead of him. Brandon then attempted to make a hard turn, possibly to turn the car around to go a different direction, and unfortunately, he misjudged this turn, and the car became stuck in a ditch. Some reports make it seem like Brandon had gotten into a car accident with the way it's described, but it wasn't anything serious. The car didn't receive any damage. This was a shallow ditch, but it had a steep incline, and somehow Brandon managed to get his Chevrolet Lumina's frame caught in the ditch, and two of its wheels were literally off the ground, so when he would try to press the gas pedal, the wheels would just spin in the air, and this car wasn't budging. I'm going to safely assume that Brandon tried for quite a while to get his car unstuck. It's definitely past midnight by the time his car got stuck in this ditch, and Brandon Swanson wasn't a big guy. He was 5'6". He was all by himself, and no matter what he did, his car was not moving anywhere. So of course, after trying to solve this issue himself and realizing that he's not going to be able to get the car out of the ditch, Brandon starts calling some of his friends for help. This is proven when investigators pulled his cell phone records. But Brandon was unable to get a hold of any of his friends, and reluctantly, after trying all other options, he called his parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, at approximately 1:54 a.m. on the early morning of May 14th, 2008. His parents answered, and Brandon told them his situation. He made it clear that he was completely uninjured, but that his car was stuck in the ditch, and he needed them to just pick him up. According to his parents, Brandon seemed very articulate. He was able to describe to them exactly where he believed he was at, and they to this day don't believe that Brandon was incoherently intoxicated when they were speaking to him on the phone. But for some unknown reason, Brandon told his parents that he was only maybe 10 minutes away from home and that he was near the city of Lind, which is really weird because we know that Brandon came from Canby, and as I already explained, Lind is south of Marshall, so no one can figure out why Brandon was so adamant that he was closer to Lind. He told his parents exactly where his location was, and Brian and Annette hopped into their car and made the journey to the location Brandon had told them he was at. Brandon was still on the phone with his parents as they were driving to come and get him. Brian was the one who talked to his son more on the phone that night. He maintains that Brandon never slurred his words. He didn't seem at all under the influence to him. Brandon just sounded frustrated while on the phone, which under the circumstances is completely understandable. It's almost 2 a.m. His car is stuck in a ditch. He had classes that prior morning. I'm sure he just wanted to crawl into his own warm bed at this point and go to sleep. Brian and Annette followed Brandon's directions and were on the road between Marshall and Lind. And within about 10 minutes, they told Brandon that they were in the area. Brandon waited to see his parents and their headlights, but no one ever came. Like I said, they were on the phone with each other the entire time. Brandon is starting to get pissed and he's arguing with them saying he doesn't see them. He's like, where the fuck are you guys at? He's getting impatient. Brian and Annette are also getting frustrated. They keep telling Brandon that they are exactly where he told him he would be at. At one point, Brian and Annette then began flashing their headlights and honking their horn, hoping Brandon would see or hear them. And again, Brandon told them he cannot see them at all. Brandon actually got back into his car that's still stuck in the ditch and began to do the same thing, flashing his lights and honking the horn. He asked his parents if they saw this, and again, they said no, they are not seeing each other or hearing each other at all. Brian and Annette said they had driven up and down the road several times, and yet they could not find Brandon. Brandon was so beyond sure he was at the location he described to them near Lind. And he was just so sure that his parents just didn't follow his directions correctly. He truly believed his parents were in the wrong area, when in reality, it was Brandon who was in a completely different location. But of course, neither Brandon, Brian, or Annette knew this at the time. At one point, Brandon became so frustrated that he hung up on his parents in anger. His mother, Annette, immediately called Brandon back. He answered and she apologized and got him to calm down. This phone call started at 2:17 a.m., so they had been searching for Brandon for a little over 20 minutes by this point. Brandon had had enough of waiting, so he told them that he was going to start walking towards the direction of the city lights that he was able to see in the distance. He told his parents he could see the lights of Lind, and he asked them to meet him at the parking lot of a bar called the Linwood Tavern. This bar is no joke right at the entrance of the town, so it was to both Brandon and his parents the best meetup point where they couldn't possibly miss each other. Brandon begins his walk, and assuming Brandon was where he claimed he was, Brian knew it would take him longer to reach Lind by foot than it would take them to reach it by car. So he decided he was going to go ahead and drop off Annette at their home in Marshall. Brian drops Annette off at home, and the final phone call between Brandon and his father Brian began at 2:23 a.m. As Brandon began walking, he described to his father his surroundings as he was walking along the road, which this was definitely smart for them to do. At one point, Brandon tells his father that he's going to go ahead and get off the road and go through this field in order to get to the city quicker. He figured that going through the field would be faster than walking all the way around with the road. As he was walking through the field, he was still describing the surroundings to Brian. Brandon told Brian that he could hear running water somewhere near him, and he also told him that he had come across a fence and that he was climbing over it. The temperature outside during this night was in the low 40s, and it was dropping. So it's pretty cold outside to be out there, and Brandon was not dressed for this cold weather. Several minutes passed with Brandon still describing what he was doing to Brian, and then all of a sudden, at approximately 3:10 a.m., Brandon says, "Oh shit," and then the call goes silent. And I want to be clear on this because some articles say that the phone went dead after Brandon shouts, "Oh shit," but that's incorrect. The call doesn't hang up, it just goes silent, and Brandon never says another word during this phone call. Of course, after hearing his son shout this, Brian starts to freak out. He's like, "Brandon, what happened? Are you okay?" But Brandon doesn't respond. After a minute or so passes and Brandon still doesn't say anything, Brian hangs up the call and immediately tries to call Brandon several times, but he doesn't answer. The phone rings, but it continues to go to voicemail. Just a side note, I'm really curious in what way Brandon actually says "oh shit," because it's never explicitly stated how he says it, and what I mean by this is, did he shout it and go, "oh shit," or did he say it like, "oh shit"? Because depending on what way he said it, it could make a difference to what could have happened to him. But regardless, Brandon saying "oh shit" is the last thing that anyone ever heard him say. Brian is starting to freak out at this point. He just heard his son say "oh shit" and has not been able to get a hold of him since. And that is beyond scary to think about. His initial thought was that Brandon just fell down or tripped, and so he went back to the area he believed Brandon was in, and he started driving up and down the road, praying that he could find him. And Brian still could not find anything, not his car, and definitely not a trace of Brandon. He was still trying to call, but Brandon's phone rang, then went to voicemail as the call went unanswered. Brian didn't know what to do at this point, so he called Annette, told her what happened, and so she tried to call Brandon a few times, and she got the same result. The phone would ring and then go to voicemail. Brian then picked Annette back up and they called some of Brandon's friends and explained to them what had happened. Thankfully, some of Brandon's friends volunteered to help Brian and Annette look for Brandon, and they all searched for him for the rest of the night. And again, they found nothing around the area Brandon had believed he was at. At 6:30 a.m., with no sign of Brandon, his parents called the police to report him missing at the Lind Police Department. Here's where it gets infuriating, because the police department showed no concern for Brandon whatsoever. His parents became really upset with their reaction when they reported Brandon missing. According to the Swansons, the police pretty much told them to calm down, that Brandon was a 19-year-old college student, and one police officer had the audacity to tell Brian and Annette that their son was an adult and had a right to go missing. Like, what the fuck is he talking about? A right to go missing. I cannot stand when concerned family members report their loved one missing and they get this type of shitty response. They told the police everything from that night, but apparently they didn't care enough and didn't think these were weird circumstances, even though Brandon specifically called his parents for help to come and pick him up. They treated it as if he decided to just run away, and since he's an adult, they didn't have to go looking for him. Time here is being wasted. Instead of organizing a police search party looking for Brandon, they did nothing at first. Arguably, if they had taken this case more seriously from the beginning, this could have been and should have been a solved case. It took hours for Brian and Annette to convince this joke of a police department to file Brandon as a missing person. After they finally filed Brandon Swanson as a missing person, the first reasonable thing they did for this case was to pull Brandon's cell phone records in order to pinpoint Brandon's last known location. The last ping from his cell phone showed to the surprise of everyone that it wasn't anywhere near the location of Lind, the area that Brandon himself believed he was near. It showed that Brandon was somewhere between the cities of Taunton and Porter, which is 25 miles away from Lind and roughly 13 miles away from Canby, the location we know Brandon started at when he left the second party by midnight. The searches for Brandon were immediately moved from Lind to the Taunton and Porter area. Brandon's phone records would also show that his cell phone pinged off a tower in Minneota, another city that was between Canby and Marshall. It is very likely that it was either Porter's or Minneota's lights that Brandon had been heading towards that night. We have no way of knowing which city, but we can confirm that it wasn't the city of Lind that Brandon had believed it to be. Once the search had been moved to the correct area, investigators quickly found Brandon's abandoned car stuck in the ditch that Brandon had described to his parents. His Chevrolet Lumina was found on a gravel road 1 mile north of Highway 68 along the Lincoln County line. With Brandon's car being found within Lincoln County's jurisdiction, the sheriff from Lincoln County was notified per protocol, and now multiple police departments were involved in this case. Investigators then looked through Brandon's car. They didn't find any blood indicating Brandon had been injured. There was no damage to the car. It was exactly how Brandon had described the situation. The car was stuck in the ditch with 2 wheels inclined in the air, which prevented him from being able to get it out of the ditch. Finding Brandon's car ended up giving more questions than answers. For one, since this was a gravel road, there were no footprints indicating which direction Brandon headed when he decided to start walking. With his car being found in this area, we can also conclude that Brandon had no clue where he was at. He had been so adamant to his parents about his location and being near the city of Lind, and this doesn't make any sense. Brandon lived around this general area his entire life. No one understands how he could have been so far off explaining his location. Police did find one item in Brandon's car that was very interesting and even more confusing. They found Brandon's glasses. The glasses Brandon always wore and that he needed to wear to be able to see. Remember, Brandon's legally blind in his left eye, so it's very weird and strange that Brandon would just start walking without wearing these glasses. Why did he leave the glasses out of all things in the car? It doesn't make any sense. Now that the police found his car, one would think that this would now be a fairly easy search for Brandon. And spoiler alert, it's not. It's the exact opposite. The amount of vacant fields and fences around this area is ridiculous. They had so much land to search, and they again couldn't tell which direction Brandon went. There weren't tracks or footprints anywhere, so they had to search all of these different directions. At 11 a.m. on Thursday, May 15th, investigators brought in cadaver dogs, hoping that they would be able to track Brandon's scent. They brought in ATVs, helicopters, planes. There were even searches while on horseback. It became a crazy search for Brandon. They used an article of Brandon's clothing given by his parents for the scent dogs to try to track him. Out of the first team of dogs they used, there was one dog who seemed to have been able to track Brandon's scent very well. Police followed this dog for approximately 3 miles through the fields and even through an abandoned farmhouse. And eventually the dog made its way to this river that's called the Yellow Medicine River. This dog at one point jumped into the river, which led investigators to believe that Brandon had fallen into this river. But the dog didn't remain in the river for very long. The dog quickly jumped back out onto the other side of the river. This could mean that if Brandon did fall into this river, that he then was able to get himself out. Investigators searched extensively in the Yellow Medicine River, and again, no traces of Brandon's things or his body were found. They found no evidence that Brandon had ever been in this river. It is reported that a few dogs, while searching around this river for Brandon, did pick up his scent again and led investigators onto another gravel road. And after a few moments on this gravel road, it appeared that these dogs lost Brandon's scent and wasn't able to track it any further. It is an important note that the gravel roads in this area coincidentally had been regraded earlier the same morning before the search began, and it cannot be proven, but a lot of people believe that this is why the dogs lost Brandon's scent, because the roads had been regraded. Many people do believe that the dogs did lead investigators in the right direction Brandon had went, because there were a few fences around this area. If you remember, while Brandon was on the phone call with Brian, he stated he had to climb over a fence. Brandon also stated at one point during the call that he could hear running water, and we just talked about the Yellow Medicine River. They seem to be in the right area, at least based on Brandon's general description to his father, but nothing of Brandon's was ever found. Several searches have been attempted throughout the last 15 years. His cell phone was never found. His car keys were never found. None of Brandon's clothing were found, and obviously no traces of his body were ever found either. It's as if he disappeared off the face of the earth. Over the years, they didn't just focus on that one specific area around the Yellow Medicine River. They expanded the search for miles, with everyone hoping and praying that something of Brandon's would eventually turn up. But to this very day, nothing has been found. At one point, while searching in the Yellow Medicine River, they actually installed these gates that were used to catch anything that could be floating in the river. The hope was that if Brandon's body was indeed somewhere in the river, that it would eventually be caught in these gates. But now we are going on 16 years since Brandon has disappeared. If anything of Brandon's had been in this river, these gates would have caught it by now. Despite several searches by land and by air, with over 120 square miles covered, nothing of Brandon's has ever been found. Investigators ended up performing 1,900 canine search missions with 45 highly trained cadaver dogs from 9 different states for Brandon's case. Some of the dogs picked up his scent and they would follow it, but then they would suddenly lose it. Others didn't pick up the scent at all. This area has been combed by investigators, volunteers, and Brandon's family members and loved ones. Sometimes the search for Brandon would be delayed or prolonged due to a combination of harvesting schedules and poor weather conditions. Don't get me wrong, this area is not an easy area to search at all. It's just absolutely insane to know that no one has found anything. Now let's get into some of the most popular theories for Brandon Swanson's case. And there are a lot of theories. I will go over the most popular theories. Just know there are a lot more out there than what I'm going to go over, because for this case, really nothing can be ruled out. The first theory is that Brandon had planned this entire ordeal just so he can run away and start a new life. He intentionally got his car stuck in the ditch and staged his entire disappearance. This theory is for the people who believe Brandon Swanson could possibly still be alive at this point. I, for one, do not believe in this theory at all. There's no evidence whatsoever that Brandon was planning on leaving his entire life, his family, his friends. In fact, I would argue the opposite. Brandon had every reason to want to stay and not disappear off the face of the earth. Brandon had just applied to a new school the following fall. Brandon and his family were beyond close. There is absolutely no way that Brandon would just abandon his entire family. And why would he? They loved him wholeheartedly. They supported everything he ever did. I absolutely do not believe he would have ever intentionally left and put his family through this hell by disappearing on them. The next theory, which I think is definitely more likely, is that Brandon had fallen into a river. Whether it's the Yellow Medicine River or another one in the area is up in the air. But the theory is that Brandon fell in, he lost his phone during the fall. Remember, Brandon didn't have his glasses on, so when the phone fell, he could have just lost it on the ground somewhere, or it could have broken into pieces. This is the year 2008, guys. He didn't have a smartphone. It was a crappy flip phone. Let's say Brandon does manage to get out of the river. Now he's cold, wet. He has no available light source without his phone. He again doesn't have his glasses on, so now he's walking blindly, getting further and further away from his car. Those who live in Minnesota know that it's generally a really cold state. It was 40 degrees and dropping on the night Brandon disappeared. Obviously, if he had fell into the river, his clothes would be soaked. Throw in the fact that we know he had a couple of alcoholic beverages that night. This only speeds up the possibility of hypothermia occurring. As his body temperature declines, he eventually passes out and succumbs to hypothermia. This to me makes a lot of sense, and for this theory, there's a lot of different variations to what could have happened to Brandon's body and why it was never found. Some people believe that Brandon could have passed out in one of the crop fields and a farmer accidentally ran over his body with farming equipment like a corn harvester or a combine. And after killing Brandon by running him over with a machine, this farmer then freaked out and then hid his body somewhere. This theory is crazy to me, but it makes a lot of sense, and it's quite common. There are many stories all over the world that this has happened to people. Google search this. There are so many accidents like this occurring where someone falls asleep in a farming field and then they end up getting killed by being run over with farming equipment. One reason why I do think this is plausible is that we know for a fact that there are some farmers that live around this area that Brandon disappeared in, and they refused to let investigators and their cadaver dogs search their land. And unfortunately, if they refuse to let them search, they have to abide by their refusal, since technically the police do not have probable cause to issue a search warrant, since again, they have no proof that Brandon could be in the farmer's land. I don't understand why anyone would refuse to let investigators search for a missing person. The only real explanation that I can think of is that they could be hiding something, and maybe that something could be the body of Brandon Swanson. And this honestly makes you wonder. Another theory as to why Brandon's body has never been found is that after Brandon fell unconscious from hypothermia, a wild animal came, attacked him, and killed him, and then dragged the rest of his body to its den. Rural Minnesota is the home to a lot of carnivorous animals. You have black bears, wolves, cougars, coyotes, mountain lions, and bobcats out there. And yes, some of you guys will argue that if he had been attacked by one of these wild animals, they would have found evidence that an attack occurred somewhere in the area. They would have found his blood, body parts, or shreds of his clothing. There would have been something, right? Well, not if one of these animals thought Brandon, who may have been unconscious, was already dead, and therefore didn't need to attack him. It could have just dragged Brandon's unconscious and or already deceased body to its den before it attacked and ate him. Wolves and coyotes are known for doing this, finding recently deceased bodies of animals and bringing it to its home for its pups to eat. This is beyond terrifying to think that this could have been what happened to Brandon Swanson, especially if he had still been alive as the animal dragged him to his home to eat him. Another theory is while Brandon was stumbling through the fields, he fell into a cistern or a sinkhole. A cistern is like a well. It's a large tank-like structure used to hold water, and Minnesota has a ton of these cisterns. And some of them are over 100 years old and are not marked. So it's possible Brandon accidentally fell into one, and that's what the oh shit exclamation was about, and Brandon eventually passed away, unable to get himself out. A sinkhole is the same concept. Brandon made a wrong step and a sinkhole swallowed him up. I think this could also be likely. It's a decent explanation of why nothing of Brandon's was ever found. On top of theories regarding the fate of what may have happened to Brandon, I also found some interesting theories for parts of this case that don't make any sense, like why Brandon was completely wrong about his location that night. Someone on Reddit posted the possibility that when Brandon had gotten his car stuck in the ditch, although he told his parents he was uninjured, he could have hit his head and received a concussion. This could explain why Brandon had gotten confused about his location, and this could even explain why Brandon took off his glasses in the first place. Maybe his glasses even fell off his face when he hit his head. People who have received concussions have displayed confusion to where they are at, and have also displayed very frustrated emotions. And if you remember, during his phone calls with his parents, at one point Brandon became so irritated that he hung up on them. Yes, investigators confirmed they did not find any blood inside Brandon's car, but Brandon's head didn't have to be bleeding for him to have gotten a concussion. Humans can get concussions just by hitting their head the wrong way. We can't rule out this possibility. These are just a few of the many theories people have come up with throughout the years. Any of them are possible. Some clearly are more likely than others, but none can honestly be ruled completely out. Brandon Swanson's disappearance is an enigma, to say the least. Comment down below which theory you believe. Or if you believe in a different theory I didn't mention, please comment those theories as well and why you believe in that theory. I would love to read more theories anyone has on Brandon's case. It's a fascinating case. My heart breaks for Brandon's family and loved ones. I cannot imagine how agonizing this entire situation has been for them. In 2015, Annette Swanson did an interview about her son's disappearance, where she explained how she did not believe that Brandon was still alive. She stated, quote, "Maybe I'm a terrible mother for this, I don't know. But I felt very early on, before the first 24 hours were up, that something terribly wrong had happened. It's a weird place to be, because there's always a little glimmer of hope, but then I think that's my heart. But my mind knows it's not going to happen that way." Close quote. During this interview, she also said how her and Brandon's sister Jameen were talking about Brandon one day, and Annette told her that she's not sure Brandon is going to be found in her lifetime. And Jameen replied back to her mom and stated, "I don't think he's going to be found in my lifetime," which is just so awful that that's how they feel. I really truly hope that they are wrong and that they do find out what happened to Brandon. His family deserves to know. How the Swansons were treated at the very beginning of this case is absolutely unacceptable. And the Swansons thought so as well, because about a year after Brandon disappeared, they took action, and an extremely positive law was passed. In May of 2009, the governor of Minnesota signed and passed Brandon's law, with Brandon's parents, Annette and Brian, and his sister Jameen in attendance during the ceremony. This law is an expansion of Minnesota's Missing Child's Act, replacing the word child with people. This law required law enforcement to take a missing persons report without delay after notification of someone missing under dangerous circumstances, no matter the missing person's age. They are also to immediately conduct a preliminary investigation to determine if the person is missing and whether the person is endangered, and promptly notify all other law enforcement agencies of the situation. The Swansons knew this law would, of course, not be able to help their son's case, but they wanted to help future cases, and they definitely did. Brandon's law has saved countless lives. It's just an absolute shame that Brandon had to disappear before a law like this was passed. If law enforcement had taken Brandon's case more seriously from the moment Annette and Brian reported him missing, maybe they could have found Brandon and even saved his life. But sadly, we will never know. But that is it from me today. If you enjoyed listening or watching this case, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for me. And if you really enjoyed it, please post the link of this video on social media platforms. Continue to spread awareness for not only this case, but for all cases. And I will catch all of you guys on the next True Crime Thursday with case 21. But until then, bye guys.